will conclude the BHM Comedy Hour and get on our main event. Before we get started, I'm going to give a couple of upcoming announcements. This coming Saturday, if you don't have St. Patrick's Day plans, you all remember the museum would like to come to our concert with Landlocked, is a Celtic rock band, from 5 to 6 Saturday evening in May. Part of the downtown Buffalo. March 31st, Jordan, who just left the room. Jordan was the gentleman up here with me. We'll be here to talk for our evening lecture on toys and pop culture. This is coinciding with the current temporary exhibit that we just opened 2 days ago. We didn't break it. So after the lecture, please glad to see it. So he's going to come and give us our evening lecture on the history of iconic toys and how pop culture shapes those and how toys shape pop culture. It's going to be very interesting. March 31st, 7 o'clock, Thursday night. And to say that he's excited about it this time, we'll understand. And then one last announcement. On April 23rd, the museum is partnering with the Cartersville Farmers Market to host what we're calling the Market Garden Dinner. And we're coordinating with, I think, about 10 of the market vendors to provide some of their produce and some of their foodstuffs. And we're catering an event where it takes those food materials. And we're having a dinner up at the Booth Museum in the Ballroom. It's going to be a really nice evening to welcome the beginning of the Farmers Market season, and also celebrating the rich history of Barclay County's agricultural campus. Information about that is coming, I think it's on the website now, but more information will be coming out in 90 days. So mark your calendar for that. All right. Well, we're pleased to have today with us Dr. Annie McKenzie. McKenzie is the curator of works on paper at the Carlos Museum at Emory University, where she has been for about 12 years. Dr. McKenzie will be discussing how museums use their collections, archives, and exhibits to engage with ongoing civil rights issues. Dr. McKenzie lives in Decatur and is her first time here, but maybe not else.
Hopefully not, yeah.
Welcome, Dr. McKenzie.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here today to speak with you all. Just to preface the presentation, I'm going to kind of give a little bit of the just kind of baseline things that the Carlos has been really working toward in terms of community engagement, in terms of engaging with civil rights issues, social justice issues, just really all the ethical challenges that are facing museums today. And there are so many, right? As I'm sure you all know. Maybe do it on the thing. Okay. I can also just push the button. Oh, it might not have been on. That probably will work. Yep. Okay, so are any of you familiar with the phrase museums are neutral, museums are not neutral, right? Okay, so this is something that for the Carlos, a university museum, kind of ensconced underneath this umbrella of Emory, we have had to not only operate underneath this kind of university-wide umbrella of politics and non-engagement for a really long time. But in the recent years, it's become really important to us to really kind of step out of that a little bit and push where we can. And so to that end, we have really adopted this phrase as our own, the idea that museums are not neutral. And so what does that mean? In order to illustrate this, I read Mike Morawski writes this great blog about museums and neutrality. And he writes in this blog that museums, and this is something that I never would have, being a almost lifetime museum goer, employee, really love museums, never really would have guessed, but is apparently true. And that is that the community, museum visitors, museum goers, think of museums as kind of this really, really trustworthy source of information. They think of museums, I guess I could say, think of museums as the most trustworthy source of information, more trustworthy than encyclopedias, dictionaries. We're making the definitions, we're pulling together the themes that are educating our constituency, right? And so that responsibility really means that museums can't be neutral, right? If you have now this responsibility to educate and you understand how others view the information that you gather and you give, it's kind of an impossibility to remain neutral, right? And that's one way. Then another way is our collections, right? So our museum is primarily an antiquities museum. I'm the only curator that deals, for the most part, with works of art that are not antiquities, right? My collection, the Carlos Works on Paper collection, the collection that I manage, has works of art from 1400 all the way up to contemporary works of art and photographs, prints, drawings, and photographs. But primarily, we are an antiquities museum. And so we very, in the past, maybe not so forthrightly, but now really view opportunities to engage with the problematic items in our collection. We view this as an opportunity. And we view this as a way that we can engage openly in dialogues that revolve around issues of repatriation and restitution. We have objects in the collection that are, we say items now in the collection, that are considered to be ancestors. And so we're now working to return the ancestors to their rightful homes. We also have objects that, and this, in the history of the Carlos and in the history of most museums, there's not necessarily the knowledge of how things were obtained by dealers or donors, things like that. But in many cases, things were unlawfully obtained, things have been looted, and so it puts us in a position, again, that we are now very passionate about viewing as an opportunity to really engage in these issues of repatriation, restitution, and to educate the public in our constituency on what's happening in the museum sphere revolving around this. I mean, you think only of, the Elgin marbles, right, that were taken from Athens because Athens theoretically couldn't care for them, and the British Museum, of course, had all the resources in the world. But, now Athens could absolutely take care of them. And in fact, the Parthenon Museum is a state-of-the-art museum. And, from that point of view, why? Why are they not returned, right? But you have this kind of bastion. We think of the museum as this bastion of correctness and rightness and veracity and truth. And that is something that, as museum staff, we really are having to negotiate and really having to view, again, as an opportunity to connect better with our stakeholders. As I say up here, remaining neutral also, remaining silent is really just kind of supporting a status quo that in many cases is not a status quo that supports the stakeholders and the constituency, the community of your museum. One thing that Emory has finally done, and it has been years in discussion, and only last year has actually happened after rounds and rounds and rounds of editing, kind of a ridiculous amount, finally acknowledged that Emory's land Emory is built on Muskogee Creek land unlawfully. And Emory was also built by enslaved peoples, the Oxford campus. And this is something with, and also the acknowledgement that Emory's founders were slaveholders. And this is something that this statement only came out last year, and it coincided with a really wonderful symposium called In the Wake of Enslavement and Dispossession that was held at Emory's main campus and at Emory's Oxford campus. And at the symposium, the descendants of enslaved peoples who built the Oxford campus were invited to participate and speak, as was the Muskogee Creek Nation. And the idea behind that being to really open Emory up for a valuable relationship, right? A relationship with the people whose land Emory kind of owns right now and occupies right now. And again, this was such a long time in the making, but I think such a step towards appropriate community engagement on the part of the museum and on the part of the university, and you know, kind of hopeful as a path for moving forward. And some of the ways that I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies that exhibitions that I've worked on and that colleagues have worked on. But before that, I just want to kind of touch on some of the things that we're working on now, because we're thinking about it now. It's fresh on our minds. How to invite community engagement. We're working on now community-driven labels, and by that I mean we have, you know, our standard label, which is kind of this has been in the past, this very neutral information giving, but yet it's a curator who is subjective. And so really kind of owning that, we have worked toward inviting members of the community to contribute to labels. So in this case, we have students who are contributing. So we have our university community, of course, that is our first audience. But then we're also inviting members of the Atlanta community to contribute, contemporary artists, for example. You know, small community-based institutions, leaders of those institutions also being invited. I think docents are really the face of the museum. They're the ones giving the tours, and I think it's invaluable to have docent contributions on labels like these. Also, children just have our K through 12 audience has this wonderful way of viewing exhibitions and themes and grasping them in these really significant ways, and so it's been interesting to invite children as well to respond to works of art. But yeah, you get a label that's like this long, and so maybe it's not for every work of art in the collection, but it is, I think, very valuable not only for those who are invited to participate, but those who read the labels. Also for us to understand how our community, how our stakeholders respond. And I think it's really valuable for any visitor to look at a label and say, okay, well, this is someone that I can relate to, more so than this very kind of sterile label that we have had and will still have. We just don't have enough wall space to have labels like this for everything. We also often invite artists to respond to our collections, and that has been a really, really valuable resource, I think, for the curators, but also for the Emory community and the surrounding communities of Decatur and Atlanta. One, we get incredible artworks, right? We're able to exhibit some really incredible things. And also we get responses that are unexpected, challenging, very challenging often. And that, again, just only serves to really push us in the direction of acknowledgement, accountability, and further engagement. And then the last one is something that we aren't very good at, but that we talk about all the time: surveying. And doing so without any kind of restrictions not guiding the survey, not guiding the responses, not being afraid to ask really challenging questions, and not being afraid of the answers. And, that I'm saying all of these things doesn't mean that we've been doing this for a very long time. We haven't at all. But we're in a very interesting, very, I think, fertile space right now to be able to cultivate kind of a new environment at the museum, and we're excited about that. Okay. So I've just included this one because I think it is, I think this is a really good example of the ways in which museums sometimes unwittingly participate in damaging colonial rhetoric. So this is a photograph, albumin photograph, 19th century, of the Sphinx and a group of dignitaries. And this was given to the museum last year, 2 years ago. And this is something that in the past and now still many museums would, and we have, of course, our ancient Egyptian collection. This is an image that might have been reproduced and put on a didactic panel as an illustration, right, of a certain period in the Sphinx's deterioration. But what goes unsaid here is who these dignitaries are, what are they doing there? They're white, they're standing all over the Sphinx, climbing all over the Sphinx. And here you have in the center, Teddy Roosevelt. And that's, when we got this photograph, we didn't know that Teddy Roosevelt was front and center there. We didn't know about this particular trip that was taken. It was simply called dignitaries even, a word that assigns value, dignitaries at Sphinx excavation. And here you have Teddy Roosevelt being led by an Egyptian man. And even that photograph, the climbing all over the Sphinx, the being led on your horse, it shows kind of these levels of power and these levels of ownership they're just inherently there when you're looking at this image. And questioning images like this and questioning how we display them, why we display them, putting them in the right context, these are things that are essential, really essential. And when you look at your collections, and you think about how to pull things together for an exhibition, you think about the themes that you want to present or that you think are valuable. And then when you look back at images like this one with this kind of fresh focus, the themes kind of shift themselves, kind of naturally shift to issues of colonialism, and you kind of change what you might have wanted to say. And I think that those instances, when you feel that, when you encounter moments like that, those are really incredibly important, and those are moments to seize. And that, and again, this is like ideally what everyone would be doing. And we, again, we haven't historically been very good at this either. But these, again, present opportunities to really kind of invest in this dialogue. So I'm going to talk about one exhibition, or actually, no, I'm going to talk about two exhibitions. This one was from a few years ago. This one took place at the very beginning of the pandemic, during quarantine. And the museum was closed, and this was over the summer. This was just after we put this together, just after the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. And we, museum staff and students, Emory students and Emory staff, really wanted to make a statement, some kind of statement, thought, but Emory was very reticent to issue a statement. The Carlos leadership was very reticent at that point to issue a statement. We, staff, in the ways that we could, started to put together programs and exhibitions where we could kind of give voice to those without a voice, just to kind of at least get some sort of statement out there. Eventually, of course, they did. In my mind, still too late. But so this exhibition was based on a group of photographs that were gifts to the museum from 2014 to 2018. It was called Testament. These are all photographs by Danny Lyon. If you've seen a civil rights photograph from the 1960s, there's a 90% chance that Danny Lyon took it. He was ubiquitous in photography at that point in time. This image that I'm showing you now is from a later series called Conversations with the Dead that I'll get back to in just a second, that had to do with documenting the Texas penitentiary system from the inside. And he really kind of became an activist for the incarcerated there in Texas. But so looking at photojournalism as activism, Danny Lyon, he kind of came to social activism in a sort of roundabout way. He went to Cairo, Illinois, to a civil rights protest at a public swimming pool, a segregated public swimming pool. And he met there late Congressman John Lewis, and they became very close friends. And Lewis encouraged Lyon to come to Atlanta, where SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had its home base, and work with SNCC, photograph SNCC, really be involved in all of, in the movement. And so he did. I have also here, he's not best known for these photographs, I think probably because they are so ubiquitous, and the photographer in many of these photographs isn't of course what you're concentrating on. The Bike Riders was his kind of most famous work, where he joined a biker gang. And it was actually his experiences there, where he got arrested many times during that project, and also while working with SNCC, that gave him the experiences inside prisons that kind of inspired him to do this later, Conversations with the Dead. So here's one of his photographs in Atlanta. This is the Tottle House. It was so SNCC, SNCC called SNCC. What their primary mode of protest activism was simply sitting at a segregated lunch counter and asking for service, right? And so here you have, and I love Danny Lyon's titles are so amazing, because he defines everything often that's happening in the photograph, and really kind of, emphasizes not the tirelessness with which SNCC operated. But often they would sit there, ask to be served, and then police would be called, and they would simply go limp and be arrested and taken to jail. And here you have in the back, there's John Lewis there. And so Lyon participated. He not only photographed, he was also a participant. And his primary, modus operandi was that the photographer a photojournalist photographer is acting as a witness, and that is the value. That's what they can contribute. And beyond that, he thought that in order to sufficiently witness, not beyond taking photographs, one had to take a very, very good photograph, a technically perfect photograph. He was a master technician in the darkroom, and in fact, he and John Lewis, when they traveled they stayed in the same hotel room often. And there's a wonderful Whitney. They did a retrospective of Danny Lyons several years ago, and they invited John Lewis and Danny Lyons to speak together. And John Lewis talks about how he thought, he said, well, you know, Danny almost killed me one time. And Danny starts laughing, and he's talking about the developers, the developer and the fixer, photochemicals in the bathroom. And John Lewis went in and thought that it was mouthwash, but was saved before anything horrible happened, thankfully. But that's kind of like the on the spot making of the picture. I mean, he's developing in a motel room. He's printing even in a motel room. So it's this kind of fast pace producing of a perfect picture, producing a perfect picture to witness to the harsh treatment, to the tireless efforts of SNCC. It's another photograph from that time frame. Taylor Washington, high school student. This was his 8th arrest, and Danny had witnessed a number of them. And he captures this. This is also, it's not a Toddle House, but it was another lunch counter that Washington had simply gone up to and asked for service. He also traveled with Martin Luther King. You see King, and that's Abernathy, Ralph David Abernathy, you're with him. And he was in jail, actually, in Albany with Dr. King. And this is right after Dr. King and Abernathy were released, and Reverend Abernathy were released from jail. This is after being arrested for not having a permit to protest or have a sit-in. And as they often did, they elected to go to jail rather than pay the fine. And they often use this time to think and, and really kind of mobilize the movement, SCLC. But yeah, so they were in jail this night before, and still to this day, anonymous African-American man paid their bail. They were released. Danny had also been released, and he captures this video on the way, or this photograph on the way out of the jail. I'm going to go back to this Conversations with the Dead. This is where Lyons activism really kind of takes hold. He leaves SNCC for this project. He worked with the head of the Texas penitentiary system and was able to gain access to 7 Texas penitentiaries. And this had never before happened. And he was there in his mind to photograph the conditions, knowing the harsh treatment, then to print this series and kind of get these images out there to the broader public, very against mass incarceration. But the head of the Texas penitentiary system, I believe his name was Bezos? I know, not the Amazon guy. But he had just made what he thought, this is why he allowed Lyon in, he had just made what he thought were these vast improvements to the penitentiary system. He had integrated the population, which for the population in the prison system, it was not what was safe for them. And he did it because it would be the first Southern state to do so, but he did it with no thought. It was not a thoughtful and mindful process. He just kind of made these changes. And so Lyon is invited in to see all these changes. But what he ends up producing here is one of the most significant works, I think, on mass incarceration and the shifting of identity. In this group of photos, it's called, there's a whole book on it, Conversations with the Dead, and I encourage you to have a look at it if you can get a hold of one. I think Amazon every once in a while will have one come up. But as you look at the photographs in the series, you come close to, these are two men in the intake line, and he doesn't ever give names, he gives sentences. And so you can see, you start to approach this through issues of racial inequality, because you see that the white prisoners have shorter sentences than the prisoners of color. And so you come close to these men and women. He was also allowed in one of the women's penitentiaries. And then you get this further back view like you see in the meal line. And I think that what you start to get is this notion of the erasure of identity, the erasure of the individual. And that, along with the harsh conditions, is something that Lyon really wanted to show. Again, you also, as he always does, gives you just a brilliantly perfect photograph here on the left. I mean, you can almost hear the door close. And on the right, you see these kind of intimate portraits of cells, men trying to make this tiny cell something more like home, and kind of the doors closing in, the walls closing in, loss of self trying to be revived here. The harsh conditions of the line, that's where he always wanted to be. He wasn't always allowed to go, because he witnessed heat strokes, he witnessed death. And that was what he wanted to capture. That's the main thing that he wanted to get out, was how harshly the prisoners were treated. But here again, you get this group shot. This guy up here in the background is one of, there maybe 2 or 3, 4, where the prisoners are actually, the incarcerated are actually looking at you. That's one of them. And here you have returning from the line. On the right, you have cotton pickers. And here, Danny Lyon makes a very definite comparison, right, to the period to enslaved peoples. These were all former plantations, the penitentiary systems that he was allowed into. And here, with his technical precision, he makes a very direct comparison to simply having, with emancipation, simply having the incarcerated population take over for those who were enslaved. I think this photograph is really this is the only one that has the open sky behind him. He's got a life sentence, and just, I love that juxtaposition of, the closeness of his face looking down with the free open sky behind him. And here again, you see returning from the fields, this kind of erasure of a singular identity, only belonging to this incarcerated population. I'll just go through a couple more. I want to get to the next show. In this main corridor after work, there was also I think was it Ramsey? I can't remember which penitentiary it was, but there was also one where essentially just children were being incarcerated up to age, I think, 22, which is what you see here. And this is one of the others where there's a direct address to the photographer. Danny Lyon did eventually testify on the floor of Congress, and during that, these photographs were used as evidence. The Texas penitentiary system had been sued, and so some strides were actually made here. So some difference was made. Just checking the time. That one was produced during the first stages of quarantine, right? So that one, we couldn't have anyone come. We were only able to reach out through videos and programming. It was, you all, I'm sure, remember, it was just, it was really difficult to be a museum and try to connect with the people that you are serving. And it was frustrating, and combining that with the social unrest, and it was just a really fraught time for, I think, everyone. But it was very difficult to also notice a need and be trying to, make some kind of connection, and being unable to do so. So the second exhibition that we did in Works on Paper during this time was called Resonance. And it was, again, those were recent acquisitions. These were also recent gifts to the collection. But this was a different thing. This was trying, as we went through quarantine, as we got more and more isolated, this was really an attempt through both the exhibition and the programming, the kind of video programming surrounding the exhibition, to offer viewers a space, whether it was virtual. We had started opening up every once in a while at that point, to Emory faculty, staff, and students, and then later on to the public. Offer viewers a space to interpret, offer viewers a safe space to remember, to think about their own experiences, but also to kind of think about the experiences of others, right? The loss experienced by others, isolation, financial hardships, death, just trying to offer a safe space for that. Along with that, we were trying to bring in things that we lost, kind of these figments, these things that we lost, we hoped we might have again, fond memories, concerts, games, pro football game, pro basketball game. And so it was a space for viewers to reflect. And I feel like that, was pretty successful as a way to engage with our community in kind of a different way. There wasn't much text. That was kind of hands off. Really just a viewing space, and sometimes the words of the photographers. These two were Kristen Kapp. She is an activist who lives in Namibia, in Windhoek, Namibia, teaches photography there. This series is from a series in which she went to these small nonprofit organizations in rural communities in Namibia and photographed there. Her photographs are phenomenal. But they give kind of a sense of both isolation here on the right, absence on the left. One of Kristen Kapp's main tenets of her own practice is she doesn't think of herself as a portraitist in the traditional sense. She doesn't take photographs of people all the time. She has in her early work. But now she prefers to capture this portrait of a person in their absence. And so I think for us during the early kind of mid stages of the pandemic, when absence was, a thing that was very tense, very, very heavy on everyone's minds, her photographs really kind of resonated. It's the title of the show. This is another of hers. Another portrait in the absence of a person. These are two incredible photographs by one of my favorite photographers, Walter Yost, pretty much lifelong Sports Illustrated photographer. He started working for them when he was a teenager. This is probably the most famous sports photo, definitely the most famous football photo of all time, lovingly called The Catch. Walter Yost did take a kind of sojourn where he worked for Paramount for a while, and this is when he took this incredible picture of Jimi Hendrix. So here we're thinking live music, full stadiums, this kind of crowd joy, something that even at this point, would we ever get that again? Position at Vanderbilt, and we're all very sad about that. But that exhibition is so interesting and so different, and takes a totally different, I don't know, it's a very interestingly curated, brings in a lot of contemporary artists who are dealing with things like environmental crisis, disenfranchisement, dispossession, or political horrors, things like that. That's what we have up now. Indigo Prayers, Charmaine show is opening Saturday, and both of those will be up through the end of the semester.
The Barker History Museum membership gets you into one of those.
Yes.
Really? Yeah, the students are.
Part of the Southeast Pacific Community.
Yeah, and that's the special exhibitions too. So the whole kit and caboodle.
I do get directly to one, absolutely.
And our permanent collections are also always open. Okay. So thanks. We appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Dr. McKenzie, for being here. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. This was a pleasure. This was great.
Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next time.